In 16.4, we're going to take a look at the evidence that scientists study that leads them to believe that living things are closely related or more closely related than some people think. The first thing that scientists look at is biogeography, which you look at the word bio, living, geography, location. So it's the study of where organisms live now and where they and their ancestors lived in the past. So two things here that are significant. The first is what we talked about yesterday or the other day with the rheas and the ostriches and the emus, that closely related species differentiate in slightly different climates, and that very distantly related species develop similarities in similar environments. The biogeography of the Galapagos species showed, with the tortoises and with the finches, suggested to Darwin that populations on the island had evolved from mainland species. So there were natural selection processes on the islands, like food supply, that made Darwin think, okay, this is why the finches' beaks look the way they do. So we had variations in beak shape, variations in shell shape, and neck shape for the land tortoises as well. On the other hand, like I said, the ground-dwelling birds, the rheas, the ostriches, and the emus, all inhabited grasslands on 3 different continents. Differences in body structures with those animals made Darwin think that they evolved from different ancestors, but the fact that they had similarities and they inhabit similar habitats led Darwin to believe that there's some sort of pressure put on species by the environment and how they adapt to the environment. The other thing that scientists look at is the age of the Earth. Hutton and Lyell, bringing that back around, said that the Earth was indeed very old, but we couldn't figure out specifically how old. Geologists now take a look at radioactivity to establish the age of certain rocks. Radioactive dating, you'll get into in your chemistry classes next year, indicates that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And again, that goes along with the deep time concept that we talked about. This is almost impossible for our brains to comprehend how long that is. But plenty of time for evolution to take place. Scientists look at fossils. Since Darwin, there were little amount of fossils in 1859 when Darwin was doing his thing. Since then, there have been hundreds of fossils that are called what we call transitional fossils, intermediate stages in what they think is the evolution of many different groups of modern species. Caution you again that we're looking at one puzzle piece of a 500-piece puzzle, and that it's estimated because creating a fossil requires such a specific set of circumstances. The vast majority of the species that have lived on Earth are virtually undiscoverable because they weren't fossilized. So even though we've found a lot more fossils, the story remains pretty murky. Because again, we're looking at one piece of a 500-piece puzzle and trying to figure out what the puzzle is. It's problematic. Some fossils that have been recently discovered show what scientists think is the evolution of whales from ancient land mammals. So we have a flow chart here of what scientists think that evolution would have looked like. I don't know how well you're going to be able to read this, but we start here. This is the branching off from a common ancestor. So a common ancestor, let's call it CA, is right down here. You see right here, ambulocetus, which is Latin for walking whale. The limb structure suggests that these animals could both swim in shallow water and walk on land. Then we see Rhodocetus. The hind limbs were short. We see the hind limbs kind of non-weight bearing, not as much of an availability for land ambulation. So the thinking here, these guys are spending much more time in the water, and the variants that had shorter legs, it didn't matter because they were spending their time in the water. So the shorter legs didn't provide any sort of a hindrance for them. So the legs sort of went away. Basilosaurus, it says, has a streamlined body, reduced hind limbs. The skeletal features suggest that this is an ocean guy, pretty exclusively. Interestingly enough, modern whales still have reduced pelvic bones, which show evidence that there were legs attached there at some point. We'll talk about what those mean, those pelvic bones, later. So just to clarify, you may be thinking, okay, what about Lamarck and use and disuse, or inheritance of acquired characteristics? With Lamarck would say that since we're not using these little legs here, they're going to go away. What Darwin would say is the variants that are produced here, that some smaller legged varieties of this species, it didn't provide a disadvantage. And so those species still lived and passed on their genes. Now, could there be an advantage to those legs being smaller? Could it help them move their tails a little bit better? The legs wouldn't get in the way? Well, then there would be a selection for smaller legs. There are other recent fossil finds that connect the dots between dinosaurs and birds, show some connections there between fish and four-legged land animals. And again, just like I've been cautioning all along, all historical records are incomplete. History of life is no exception. We don't have the full story, and furthermore, nobody was there. We're going to take a look at anatomy and embryos of organisms that scientists use to compare. We look at the front limbs of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals here. We have the same basic bone structure. They're color-coded so you can see what's going on there, the different areas of the forelimbs. And then we have what scientists think was a common ancestor, an ancient, what's called a lobe-finned fish. And you can see that the bones are color-coded in that one as well. These are called homologous structures, homologous parts. The prefix homo means the same. These animals with similar structures evolved from a common ancestor. So they might not be used the same way, but they have the same structure. So these are homologous structures, are the same parts, different use. Ooh, that's kind of messy. Sorry. So what we do is we look at these homologous structures and try and gain information about how closely related different animals are. For example, the front limbs of reptiles and birds are more similar to each other than the front limbs of an amphibian or a mammal. So the conclusion that's drawn there is that reptiles and birds are more closely related. They diverged more recently from a common ancestor than the ones that are shared by reptiles, birds, and mammals. Now, this is tricky. The difference between homologous and analogous structures. I have two different examples in this graphic here. Let's go to what we've already learned first. These color-coded bones are homologous. They're homologous parts. They're put together the same way. They're homologous parts. They may or may not have different uses. In this case, they both allow for flight, but they're put together the exact same way. So this is homologous. Now, so I'm not confusing you, I'll erase that. Analogous structures are what you see here. The bird wing and bat wing as compared to an insect wing. So these are analogous structures. They perform the same function, but not structure. So common function, but not common structure. These are analogous structures. Make sure you understand the difference between those, homologous and analogous. Vestigial structure, now we're going to come back to the pelvic bone of a whale, and also the example here on this slide is the pelvic bone in a dolphin. Vestigial structures don't any longer serve a purpose. They're inherited from ancestors, but they're pretty much useless. We have the human appendix, the hip bones of bottlenose dolphins, the pelvis of a whale, same thing. Wings of a flightless bird. Human appendix in our common ancestor was used to break down very tough plant parts, break down and digest very tough plant parts, like literally bamboo kind of tough plant parts and bark. We don't eat that kind of thing anymore normally, and so it's not necessary. So it doesn't serve a purpose anymore, except if it gets inflamed or infected, then it can cause big problems. Another thing that scientists look at is embryology. How embryos, the study of embryos, how they look as they go through development, early development of organisms. The same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce homologous tissues and organs in vertebrates. Those are organisms with backbones, animals with backbones. More recently, we've turned to genetics. And now that you know all about genetics, you can see how this would work. A long series of discoveries back from Mendel through Watson and Crick in genomics. We went through all this. We can take a look at genetics and look at degree of relatedness. We talked about that most recently with paternity testing, DNA fingerprinting, determining degree of relatedness using mitochondrial DNA from a mother to her children, the Y chromosome from a father to his son. So now we look at genetics and it gives us a way clearer picture of what's going on. And the first and most general is that all living cells use the central dogma, DNA, RNA, and then we get protein synthesis. And that code is identical in almost all organisms, which would show, according to evolutionary biologists, a degree of relatedness. Since we all have this same genetic code, bacteria, yeast, plants, fungi, animals, then the conclusion that's being drawn is that we share a common ancestor, or life all came from the same source. If you take a look at this is a small portion of DNA for the same gene in a mouse, a whale, and a chicken. And what you see down here is the differences. The letters are a little bit larger and they're bolded. So you have, let me see here. These are the differences. Very few. And what you can do is you can determine degree of relatedness based on the number of differences. So this would say, because there are fewer differences between the mouse and the baleen whale than between the mouse and the chicken, that the mouse is more closely related to the whale than it is to the chicken. We can look at molecules. We can call those molecules homologous. Proteins share structural and chemical similarities, the way that they fold in 3 dimensions, their amino acid sequence. Cytochrome C functions in cellular respiration. Similar versions of cytochrome C are found from single-celled yeast to cells in humans. Very similar, very few differences in the amino acid sequence. These are called homologous molecules. The Hox genes that we talk about that help determine body plan in embryonic development are homologous as well. In vertebrates, animals with backbones, the sets of homologous Hox genes direct the growth of the front and the hind limbs. So because we have this shared sequence of Hox genes between lots of different organisms, we compare those and say, okay, these are similar, therefore these animals are closely related. Just a little bit more about Hox genes. Bacteria that live in a hot spring are very different from animals, but many of their genes and therefore their proteins are similar. So again, we see very dissimilar organisms that are similar in proteins and genes that are contained within them. And so the conclusion that's being made is that living organisms have, through descent with modification, have a common ancestor. Not that we came from bacteria, but that we all branched off from a common ancestor. There are scientists that are actually testing natural selection back in Darwin's stomping grounds, the Galapagos Islands. They're taking a look at those finches a little more closely. These are the Grants. Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University are working with the finches, taking a look at the different finch species, the finch varieties on the different islands, and really studying their beaks. Each species uses a beak like a tool. And depending on food, different tools are necessary. So what you see here are the different tree finches and ground finches and their different beak shapes based on the food that they eat. The Grants realized that Darwin's hypothesis rested on 2 testable assumptions. So first hypothesis they tested is there variation that can be inherited to provide the raw material for natural selection? Is there variation in beak size and shape? And second, those differences have to produce a difference in fitness, which is how suited an organism is to its environment. So we got the medium ground finch here, Geospiza, on the island of Daphne Major. And it tells you down here a little bit about this finch. Feeds on large, thick seeds with a beak that is thick, strong, and sharp. Beak works like heavy-duty wire cutters. So it leverage, strong pressure, and cutting force to feed on large, thick seeds. So the Grants have caught and tagged and identified nearly every bird of this species. They recapture the birds, they track which individuals are alive, which have died, which have reproduced, which have not, and they record very specific anatomical characteristics: wing length, leg length, beak depth, beak color, feather color, and total mass. So they're gathering all this data about these birds. Here are the conclusions. The Grants' data have shown that individual finches with different sized beaks have better or worse chances of surviving both seasonal droughts and longer dry spells. And what they found that during dry periods, birds with the largest beaks are more likely to survive. And as a result then, average beak size in this finch population has increased dramatically. So this is an example, like we talked about with MRSA, that MRSA wasn't around in 40 years ago, and now it is. This is microevolution. This is evolution. This is change over time that we can see within recorded history. It's a little easier to wrap our minds around. Changes in food supply created what's called selection pressure. It caused finch populations to evolve within decades. This change may have occurred, this is called adaptive radiation. This evolutionary change occurred much faster than researchers thought possible. That pressure caused the varieties of beaks that worked out well to stay around. They passed along their genes to the next generation. The beak shapes that didn't allow the finches to access their food, well, those guys starved, and their genes were eliminated from the gene pool. So, take-home message here: natural selection takes place in wild finch populations frequently and sometimes rapidly. Competition, environmental change can drive natural selection, like a drought, the variation in beak sizes, competition between those individuals. So evolutionary theory is based on this evidence that we looked at here today. Evolutionary theory includes natural selection. Natural selection is one part of evolutionary theory. And this is sort of ironic. Evolution is often called the grand unifying theory of the life sciences because there are different people that believe different parts of evolution, as we'll get into in the coming weeks when we talk about Earth's early history and things like that. Yes, it might be a grand unifying theory in terms of we're saying that every organism, every living thing came from one initial life form. But because we're scientists, because we're curious, because we're human and we have different opinions, it doesn't really unify in terms of what has really happened. Because again, just to reemphasize again and again, nobody was there. This is all just a guess. It's a theory, it's a hypothesis. Any new discovery can turn it absolutely on its head.